Hey everybody, Nikki the Death Doula here. I apologize, I'm putting up a rewind episode this week. My schedule just got away from me the last couple weeks and I've not had time to record a new episode or an interview. I do have some interviews coming up and some other episodes I have in mind for this season, but I just did not have it in me to get it done. I did not have the time and I apologize. So I am going to put up a rewind episode. This is from January of last year. It's episode 75, Grief, We're Doing It Wrong. It just popped out. I remember this one. I thought this might be a nice one to do. Before we dive in, I want to remind everybody, and if you've listened to my last couple episodes, I mentioned that I'm going to be launching a new online community for grief. It's the Good Grief Society. It's for anybody who is a fan of the show, who has suffered a loss of any type. It does not have to be a death loss. Anybody who just needs a soft landing space for their grief. We all know by now, grief doesn't have a timeline, grief doesn't follow a schedule, and grief is freaking rude. Am I right? But the last thing we all need is stupid platitudes that I can't stand and other BS. There's no toxic positivity here. This is just a place where you can be. You can be yourself. You can process your grief. You can talk about your losses in an environment where you will not be judged. And you don't have to worry about how you sound. Nobody in this group is going to judge you for that. We're all here just to support each other. With this, I will have once a month grief circles. Every other month, we will have special guest speakers and or workshops. And there will also be a community via Slack that is available 24/7 where you can chat with other people. And you will also get emails with journaling prompts. You're going to have journal prompts for every single day of the year. I'll be sending out weekly emails with journal prompts for the week. And who knows what else I might throw in this. So if you are interested in joining the Good Grief Society, there's a link down in the description. You can also go to my website, nikkithedeathdoula.com/podcast, where you can get information on this show and the Good Grief Society. Oh, also, before we dive in, so sorry, I have another link down in the description. I would love to do a Q&A episode, but in order to have that, I need questions. So if you have a burning question for Nikki the Death Doula, check out the link in the description. It'll bring you to a web page on SpeakPipe where you can record an audio question for me, and I will play it on my Q&A episode, which I'm hoping to do at the end of the season. So, but I'm just going to leave that up there in perpetuity. So anytime you have a burning question, please put it there. And who knows, maybe I'll answer it on an episode and play your voice. So go check that out in the description. Thanks. Okay, and without further ado, here is our rewind episode of episode 75, Grief, We're Doing It Wrong. Hello, and welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief with compassion and humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today we are going to be talking about grief. We're doing it wrong. Yep, we as a society tend to take grief the wrong way, process grief the wrong way, talk about grief the wrong way. And if you've been listening to this podcast for more than 2 episodes, you probably know that's kind of the crux of this entire show. And one of the things I complain about the most is how we as a society just don't understand grief, and we're telling everybody all the wrong things to do and all the wrong ways to process our grief. So let's just dive deep into that. But before we do, I need to do my due diligence here and remind you all of my Patreon. You can find me at patreon.com/NikkiTheDeathDoula. And if you become a patron today, you get grief affirmations in your email twice a week. You get access to this podcast a week early and ad-free, although I don't really have ads as of yet. And there will be some bonus check-ins and discounts to any upcoming workshops I will be doing in the new year. Yes, I'm going to be hosting some more workshops coming up in 2024. So you can look forward to that. All right. So let's talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about grief and what it is we're doing wrong. And this tends to lean more towards Western cultures, but this is true in other cultures as well. So I'm not going to generalize. I'm not going to say who's doing what wrong, but let's just say on the whole, we seem to have the wrong idea about grief. And I I hesitate using words like right and wrong because there is no right or wrong with grief. I mean, I'm saying at the end of every episode, your grief is yours and your feelings are valid. So whatever you're feeling is yours and you're entitled to it. But a lot of the things we're telling each other or the ways we're viewing others' griefs, other folks' griefs, is not exactly helpful. Let's put it that way. We're not going to say wrong. It's unhelpful. Okay. So what is it we are getting incorrect? What is it we're doing in an unhelpful manner with grief? Well, first of all, I did an entire episode on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her stages of grief and how that was misconstrued in a lot of ways and viewed incorrectly. They're not stages, they're not steps. It's not a 12-step program that you get through and you're magically over your grief. Go listen to that episode if you're so inclined to hear more about that. But our grief doesn't show up in predictable stages. We can start grieving long before the loss occurs. And I've talked about that in my episode on anticipatory grief. If you're caretaking for somebody who's dying, you're going to start grieving them long before they're gone. So when the loss does happen, when they do pass away, we've already gone through a huge chunk of grief. We've already started that process. So the process at that point is going to look very different than if you lose somebody suddenly and unexpectedly. And this could be not just death loss. Like I said, grief is grief. This could be job loss, pet loss, loss of a home, loss of financial security, loss of friendships, there are relationships. There's a lot of different losses out there. And our grief isn't going to show up for those in very predictable stages. And let's talk about other losses, like a loss of a relationship, whether it's a divorce or a breakup or whatever. The end of a romantic relationship can be absolutely devastating. And you might assume like, oh, it's going to be fine. There are so many terrible things we can say to somebody who've just suffered a relationship loss. Like, oh, you were too good for them anyway. You'll get over it. Let's find you somebody else to get you over this. Like, no. Allow somebody to grieve and let them be angry. Odds are anger might happen. It might not, but anger might happen. Let them be angry for a little bit. Be angry with them. Go shout at the moon. I'm always saying that. It's a fun thing to do. Go shout at the sky. Shake your fist at the clouds. Let them be angry. I've recently heard of a place not too far from here in Columbus that offers axe throwing and rage rooms. And I love this idea. They fill the room with stuff. You go in like a protective suit and you can just shatter dishes on the wall and just destroy stuff and get your rage out. Like, what a beautiful idea to have a constructive and safe way to release your anger. But back to it, we're not going to have predictable stages. So we can't say like, all right, you're going to be angry and then you're going to be sad and then you're going to be, at whatever comes next to you. That's just not how it's going to work. And as I've said before, we don't always feel feelings one at a time. It's not so neat and tidy. We're not going to be angry today, sad tomorrow. You might be angry and sad. You might be relieved and sad. You might be guilty and joyful. Like, there are so many different feelings. You're probably going to feel more than one at a time. That's totally normal. So by assuming everything is going to happen in a predictable and scheduled format, we're doing other people a disservice. Because in our minds, if we're saying you're going to go through these stages in this order and they don't, then you're going to look at them in a manner of saying, well, they're grieving wrong. No, they're not. And letting them know like, okay, well, you're angry today, so tomorrow you'll probably be sad. Don't tell people what they're going to feel. Don't think that you're going to feel one way tomorrow because you're feeling one way today. We can't anticipate stages of grief. And grief is I'm not going to say go away, but you can be separated from it for a while. And then months down the road, it's going to come back. And it's going to smack you in the face when you absolutely are not even expecting it. In my episode where I interviewed my friend Carrie, we were talking about music and how sometimes you can be out and about shopping at the mall or the grocery store and a song comes on the overhead thing and it reminds you of somebody. And it can hit you real hard at the worst time. And that's just how grief works. It comes up and taps you on the shoulder when you don't want it to. That's the thing we can predict, is that grief will be unpredictable. I know, oxymoron, right? So the next thing we're getting wrong is the idea of letting it go. and getting over it, which is something I say in every single episode, that we're not going to get over our grief. And you can't just let it go. You can't just forget it, right? What do I always say about grief? Grief is love. Grief is an expression of love. If we didn't love what we lost, we wouldn't grieve it. So if you let it go, in a manner, you're letting go of that love. Embrace your grief. Don't let it go. Hold on to it, because that's your connection to the thing that you lost. And you can't make it come back. You can't make that person come back. You can't make that thing come back. But you can stay connected to it, and you will never lose that person or that thing or that idea or whatever it is you've lost. You'll never be without it again. Your grief is your tie to that loss. And telling somebody to let it go, what an awful, awful thing to say. I know it might come from a place of heart, but please don't say things like that. And don't think things like that for yourself. Don't think, all right, I need to let this go. It's time to move on. You don't have, like I said, you're not going to get over your grief. You can't let it go. You need to hold on to it. You just need to look at it and work through it in a different manner and learn how to adapt and live with it. And by telling yourself that it's time to let go of it, it's telling you that that thing no longer matters in your life. And maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. If you're one of those people that needs to let it go, that's okay too. Another thing we're getting wrong. Grief isn't always a single thing. It's not always a one little item. I don't want to say item, but grief, let's just say grief doesn't walk by itself. There are I've talked about side effects of grief, and there's secondary griefs, and there's compound griefs. It's almost impossible, especially if it's a significant loss, like the loss of a spouse. It's not just the loss of them. It's the loss of the relationship. It might be a loss of some financial security. It's the loss of companionship. It's the loss of identity. If you've been with that person for a long period of time, you're part of a couple. And you have your own identity, but you also have the identity of being in a couple and being another part of that person. So we can't just say, well, I'm so sorry you lost your husband. You didn't just lose your husband. You lost so much more with that. And to not understand that and to not recognize it and then work through it is doing yourself a disservice again. And also understanding that for people around you who have suffered losses. If somebody's lost a job, you might, first of all, that's a hard one to really grasp, to think that they're grieving. Because when you think of grief, you think of death loss. And like I'm always saying, it's not always death loss. If somebody you know has just lost a job, they're going to grieve. And this grief isn't just necessarily the loss of income. That's a big one, right? But it could be, they may have had really good friendships at work. They might have had great relationships with some of their coworkers, and they've just lost a group of friends. They've lost maybe a sense of identity. If this was a job they had for a long time, or a job they really loved or really identified with, really wrapped themselves up in, they've just lost a sense of their identity too. So there's a lot of griefs involved in that. So recognizing that when somebody's experiencing a loss, they're not experiencing just that loss, can be incredibly helpful for someone on the outside to understand and think about. Again, if you know somebody who's experienced a loss and you want to be a good, helpful friend or guide or companion through their loss, recognize that they're experiencing more than just one loss at a time. And, I'm not going to say be a mind reader and try to think, okay, well, clearly they're going to suffer this too. Talk to them about it though. Say, hey, I'm so sorry you lost your job. Are you feeling okay about your self-worth? And I don't know, that might be a bad way to phrase it, but just recognizing that they might have that and to be a little more gentle with them. And things like the loss of somebody you've been caregiving for, they may have spent years caring for somebody and that person is now gone. And that can be really difficult to integrate back into your life prior. You might not be able to. So again, you've lost a bit of your identity because your identity was a caregiver. Okay, let's talk briefly about trauma and grief. And I am not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a licensed counselor, I'm a grief coach, but I am not specialized in trauma work. So I just want to put that little cover my butt out there on that. Trauma and grief don't always necessarily go hand in hand, because you can't really have trauma without grief. Typically with trauma, there is loss involved. So there will be a grieving process with any traumas, but you don't necessarily have trauma with your grief. You might suffer a loss and there's no real trauma involved in that. It is possible. But I had a therapist once tell me there are big T traumas and little t traumas. And in a way, you could say that all grief is a little bit of trauma with a little t. But because somebody has suffered a loss, that doesn't necessarily mean it is traumatic for them. It could be, but it doesn't necessarily mean it is. And this is really, really tricky because even if it's a secondary, tertiary, whatever loss, each one might be a little bit different. And some losses might be very traumatic for somebody and some might not be. So you don't necessarily have to approach somebody who's suffered a loss with a thing of, okay, they're clearly traumatized and this is huge. It might not be for them. It might not be super traumatic. So you don't have to approach it as thus. Typically with grief, if you're on the outside and you're trying to assist a friend or somebody in your life who has suffered a loss and you're not sure what to do or what to say, this is when you let them lead. Let them tell you where they are with this. Let them tell you if it's traumatic or not. And they might not say it in those specific words. You'll gather it from context clues, I would hope. But you're not necessarily you can't necessarily assume that there is a trauma involved in this. Now, if they have suffered a trauma, there will be grief involved. So understanding that is huge. Okay, so let's talk briefly about black and white dualities with grief and with loss. A lot of times we want to, as humans, make things very black and white. We want things to be neat and organized, and they're not. And grief never is. Grief is never neat and tidy. Ever, ever, ever. And there is no black and white with grief, right? Let's talk about divorce grief. You might have, let's say somebody has separated and divorced from an abusive spouse. And in your mind, great, good for them. They're out of that terrible abusive relationship. Screw that person. They're horrible. I'm so glad they're gone. If you look at it from their perspective, yes, they might be free of that abuse, but you were not in that relationship, and that relationship could be very complex. There could be a lot involved in that. They might be suffering a lot of grief surrounding that. That can be very difficult to have somebody in your life and then not anymore. And just because that person mistreated them doesn't mean they're not grieving that relationship a little bit. And please don't judge people for that. Please do not judge people for that. If I'm pretty open about my first marriage. My husband was not abusive, but he did have an addiction issue. And I'm not going to go into my entire relationship history, but that was a big part of why our relationship didn't work out. And I might have some negative things to say about him sometimes, but he was a good person. He loved his kids more than anything on this planet, and he was very kind. He was very sweet at times. He was very romantic at times, but I couldn't handle his addiction issues. And again, this isn't about me and my past, but there were obviously aspects of that relationship. I wouldn't have married him if he wasn't a good guy at some point, you know? Like, you have to remember that it's other people's relationships, first of all, none of your business. But relationships are complex. There's more to it than just the abuse, if that was the case of a divorce. So think about that. There might be some love involved. You can still grieve for a terrible marriage, and that's okay. So please keep that in mind. And not just for helping other people, but for yourself. If you are leaving a bad relationship like that, or if you had an abusive parent that has just died, give yourself some grace. It's okay to grieve them too. Other people might look at you and think you should be so happy that person is gone. If you miss them, that's okay. Okay, you're entitled to whatever you're going to feel, and please understand that those griefs are going to be incredibly complex. And with cases like that, that's when I tend to recommend people seek out a therapist of some type to help them pick through that trauma and that loss and work through all those myriads of complex feelings. But if nothing else, allow me to validate them for you. You're allowed to feel those feelings. You're allowed to miss somebody that may have hurt you. Okay? There was a really good book I read or listened to an audiobook very recently. It was Jeanette McCurdy, who wrote a book. The title of the book is I'm Glad My Mom is Dead. It was a really interesting read because she had a very complex relationship with her mom. And I would recommend it, giving it a listen or a read. It was very interesting. I might just do a whole episode on that and this whole thing sometime. But she had a very complex relationship with her mom. Her mom was not very nice to her, but was still her caregiver for a long time. So anyway, that's enough of that. I recommend it. So another little thing we don't think about or we don't necessarily get correct is things like there's a fluctuation in your needs. You might one day be like, I need to have all of my friends with me. I cannot be alone. I need all the support I can get. And then very next day you might say, I want to be alone. Please leave me alone. So from either side of that, respect that. If you have somebody in your life that's going through a loss or going through a grief, and one day they're like, please, I need you here, be there for them as best you can. If the next day they're like, go away, I don't want you here, don't take that personally and respect that. Let them be alone as long as you feel they're safe. If you feel they're not safe, that's a different story. But if you feel they're safe, go ahead, give them that space. Respect that. If somebody really wants to be alone, I'm one of those people. I like to be alone with my grief. I like to go through things by myself. I process things a little bit better when I'm by myself. Not always, and that's another thing. Sometimes I do not process things well when I'm alone, but sometimes I do. I need that space to be able to process things in my head for a little while. And if you are on the outside looking in, please don't like try to be their white knight and be like, I'm going to be here 24/7, whether you like it or not. You should not be alone. Don't assume that. They might want to be alone. And if you yourself want some space, let yourself have it. Give yourself that space. That's fine. You're allowed. But just understand that your needs are going to fluctuate from time to time. You might go through phases of, I need constant help. I need people to get me out of bed, to put me in the shower. I need people to do my laundry for me because I can't function. And the next day you might be like, I'm good. I got this. I'm going to do everything myself. There are fluctuations in that, and that's normal and okay. So whichever side of the grief you're on, know that and respect that for yourself and for others. And just one last thing I'm going to put out here. There's so much. Like, obviously, I have an entire podcast on this. There's so many things about grief and things that we've necessarily not been doing correctly. Again, I'm hesitating to use right and wrong, but even correct and incorrect are not the best terms. But I had an episode way back on the DSM and grief because this is becoming more widely recognized, which is good. This is something we have been getting wrong that now we are getting right. And again, I just use right and wrong, but you know what I mean. But it's the idea of long-term grief. Grief, as I'm constantly saying, it's something that doesn't go away. It's with you forever. It just changes and you adapt with it. And we have now been recognizing that long-term grief is a thing and it's valid and it's something we should recognize. Now, when it becomes disruptive to your daily life, could be when, you might need some extra help with a therapist, medications, things like that. But grief can affect us for a long period of time. And I use my brother as an example in a lot of this. And with my brother, when he died, I've mentioned this before, I didn't process my grief for him at all for probably 2 years, if not longer. I think it really finally hit me like 4 years down the road, maybe. It was a while, and it hit me, and when it hit me hard, and I really cracked. And this is my loss with him is something that is going to be with me for a long time. And he and I had a complex relationship. We didn't really get along, especially at the end. And I've got a lot of things wrapped around that. So this is going to be a grief that's not, like I said, it never goes away, but it's going to be something that's going to affect me for a long time. And long-term griefs can affect newer griefs. And again, I'm just going to keep using myself as an example, and I'll come up with some other examples too, but I recognize that my parents are going to die before I do, likely. Obviously, we don't get a choice in this matter, but it's most likely that my parents are going to pass away before me. And I still have that grief with my brother. And then my parents are going to be gone. We were a family of 4, so that's it. I will be a family of 1 at that point. Obviously, I have in-law family, I have chosen family, I have people in my life. I'm not alone, but that family of 4 dynamic is gone. It will be gone one day. And that grief with my brother is still going to be there. And it's only going to be enhanced by the loss of my parents as well. Any grief can continue on. My beautiful cat who passed away, I talk about her a lot too. That's a grief that I'm never going to stop feeling. And that's something that's going to stay with me for a while. It's not going to be the same as the grief for my brother. No 2 griefs are the same. But some of our griefs can just affect us forever. I had a coworker once who we were talking about parental loss. And I just remember her more than once telling me, when you lose your mother, that's a loss you'll never, ever, ever get over. And I appreciate her perspective on that. I can't say that for everybody, though. Obviously, we can't say that because everybody's relationships with their mothers are different. But I can understand that for her, that is a loss that will be with her forever. And that's a long-term grief. She's going to be hurting from that probably for the rest of her life. So there are those significant losses that are going to stay with us for a long period of time. And with that said, I'm always saying there's no timeline for grief. We can't make one. We can't force one on ourselves. Our grief is going to be what it's going to be, and you can't put a timeline on anybody else's grief. Your grief might grow. It might get bigger. It might get worse with time and then wane off. It's hard to say. We don't know. We can't predict this. Back to the very top. The only thing we can predict with grief is that it's going to be unpredictable. So there is a new diagnosis in the DSM of prolonged grief disorder. So that is a thing that exists. And I'm glad that we're recognizing that now. Because if you think back to, a few hundred years ago, you'd have somebody that was still grieving somebody that lost 10 years prior. Society would probably slap them in a loony bin. Like, how awful did we treat people who were grieving? And I've been, learning a lot more about child loss with my work with the new nonprofit here, Let the Light In, for women who have suffered pregnancy and infant loss. And I'm learning a lot more about that. That I imagine is a trauma and a grief that can never possibly go away. I've never experienced it personally, so I can't say. But from the women I know who have, that is something you never, ever, ever forget. And that is a grief that will continue to hurt for a long time. Okay. Whew, that got a little heavy, didn't it? So again, I hesitate using words like right and wrong. I hesitate saying good and bad for good reason, because whatever you're going to feel is valid. And you're going to suffer your grief in your way and on your terms. And nobody can tell you different. And don't tell anybody else different. So if that's all you take away from this episode, take away that. I mean, what do I say at the end of every episode? Your grief is yours, your feelings are valid, and grief doesn't always have to suck, because it's true. Your grief is yours, okay? And the only predictable behavior of grief is that it will be unpredictable. Okay. All right, guys. So with that, it is now time for the Death Deck. Yay. All right, I'm going to shuffle the cards up. Pull one at random. Okay. Ooh, this is an interesting one. And I might do an entire episode on this topic, but whole body donation, which is donating your entire body for research with your family receiving cremated remains later, is A, a final piece of value to give the world through science, B, a nice thought, but no, C, 100% creepy. I mean, they'll be poking around everywhere. This is something I have chosen not to do for myself, but I do love and appreciate that is an option. And I love and appreciate people that choose this option. I have some friends that have chosen to do something like this. Like I said, I could do a whole episode on this, but if you are at all interested in this topic, read the book Stiff, The Curious Life of Human Cadavers by Mary Roach. She goes into what happens when you donate your body to science. Really, really interesting read. If you're into that, if you're not, that's okay. No offense. Okay. Thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. I appreciate you, all my listeners, and I love you all, and I hope you are having an amazing week. Please don't forget to check me out on Patreon, patreon.com/NikkiTheDeathDoula. And you can find me on the socials as well. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, all at Nikki the Death Doula. And you can find my website, NikkiTheDeathDoula.com. I should have some great things coming up this year. I've got some wonderful plans. I talked about some workshops, and yeah, I'm hoping to just have some great new things out there for the world because I'm so passionate about what I do, in case that's not obvious. All right, everybody. I hope you have an amazing week. And remember, as always, your grief is yours, your feelings are valid, and grief doesn't always have to suck. Good Grief with Nikki the Death Doula is produced by Nikki Smith of Nikki the Death Doula LLC in Columbus, Ohio. Nikki the Death Doula LLC is for consulting, education, emotional support, and guidance, and is no way considered a funeral establishment or licensed mental health establishment. Scripts, editing, sound design, literally everything with this podcast is done solely by Nikki Smith of Nikki the Death Doula LLC, with the exception of the music. The music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod. Licensing information can be found at filmmusic.io.